They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes the water offered by a stranger is the only thing that can quench a dying man's thirst, while the blood of his kin only clamors for a price. In the sterile silence of the Vanderbilt wing of a private New York hospital, this truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The relentless beep of the heart monitor was the only sound that dared to measure the final moments of Leo Vanderbilt, heir to a real estate empire, now reduced to a fragile figure beneath starched white sheets. His wife, Alara, sat beside him, her presence a quiet island in a cold sea of hostility. She gently dabbed his forehead with a cool cloth, her movements filled with a tenderness that seemed out of place in the opulent, soulless room. Across from her, two figures sat like perfectly sculpted vultures, waiting for the end. Beatrice Vanderbilt, Leo's mother, was a woman carved from ice and diamonds, her grief a well-rehearsed performance. Beside her was Isabella Thorne, Leo's mistress, her beauty as sharp and polished as the stilettos on her feet. They weren't watching Leo, they were watching Alara, their eyes filled with a shared, venomous disdain. Beatrice leaned slightly towards Isabella, her voice a low, poisonous whisper, perfectly calculated to slice through the air and find its target. Look at her, still playing the dutiful wife. The farm girl probably thinks she'll get a bigger piece of the pie this way. The words struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. The air in her lungs seemed to vanish, replaced by a crushing weight. For a moment, the room blurred, the beeping of the monitor fading into a dull roar in her ears. But she did not flinch. She did not turn. She did not give them the satisfaction of her tears. Her gaze remained fixed on her husband's pale face. The only sign of the storm raging within her was the hand she kept hidden from their view, resting on her lap. Her fingers curled into a tight fist, her nails digging so deeply into her own palm that she could feel the sharp sting of pain. It was a small, secret violence, an anchor in the torrent of humiliation. They saw a simple farm girl, a naive fool they could easily discard. They had no idea that in her silence, she was not breaking, she was forging something far more dangerous, something built from pain, patience, and a promise she had made to herself: justice. It hadn't always been like this. A battle waged in whispers across a dying man's bed. The memory came to her then, unbidden, a ghost of warmth in the glacial cold of the hospital room. It was a memory bathed in the golden light of a Midwestern sunset, smelling of rich earth and looming rain. Before she was the farm girl of Beatrice Vanderbilt's derision, she was simply Alara, a daughter of that earth. Her world was not one of sterile corridors and silent judgment, but of vast, open fields of corn that whispered secrets to the wind, and a sky so wide and blue it felt like a promise. Her hands, which now trembled slightly as she adjusted Leo's pillow, had once been steady and strong, calloused from mending fences, tending to the animals, and pulling life from the soil. There was a simple, profound dignity in that life, a rhythm tied to the seasons, not the stock market. She met Leo on a Tuesday in late summer. He hadn't arrived in a chauffeured town car, but in a dusty, ridiculously expensive sports car that had sputtered to a halt a mile down the road from her family's farm stand. He had walked, his polished Italian shoes coated in a fine layer of brown dust, his bespoke suit looking utterly alien against the backdrop of rolling hills. He didn't ask for directions to the nearest luxury hotel. He just asked for a glass of water, his voice tired, stripped of the arrogance she would later learn his world demanded. There was a fracture in his composure, a deep-seated weariness in his eyes that no amount of money could hide. She gave him the water and a handful of fresh strawberries, still warm from the sundae. He ate them slowly, thoughtfully, as if he'd never tasted real food before. He didn't know her name, and more importantly, she didn't know his. To her, he wasn't a Vanderbilt. He was just a man from the city, with sad eyes and a surprisingly gentle smile. That was the beginning. He had the car towed to the local mechanic, who, in no particular hurry, said it would take a few days. Leo checked into the town's only motel, and every day he would walk to the farm. He said he was drawn to the quiet, but Alara knew he was drawn to the authenticity. He was a man drowning in a world of pretenders, and he had just found solid ground. He was clumsy, a creature of boardrooms and galas, trying to understand a world of grit and patience. He tried to help her paint a fence, and ended up with more white paint on his $1,000 shirt than on the wood. She had laughed, a real, unrestrained laugh, and he had looked at her with a sense of wonder. He confessed later that it had been years since someone had laughed with him, not at a calculated joke, he told, or in a way that was meant to curry favor. Their conversations unfolded under the sprawling canopy of the night sky, illuminated by fireflies instead of chandeliers. He spoke of a life that felt like a gilded cage, of expectations that had been placed on him since birth, of a loneliness so profound it echoed in the grandest of ballrooms. She spoke of the land, of the satisfaction of watching a seed grow into sustenance, of family, of community, of a life that was rich in everything but money. He was seeing the world through her eyes, and he was falling in love with its simplicity. She was seeing the man behind the myth, and she was falling in love with his vulnerable heart. When the car was finally fixed, a silence fell between them. The real world, his world, had come to reclaim him. He stood before her, the city polish returned, the expensive car humming impatiently behind him. He didn't want to go. He told her his apartment in New York felt colder and emptier than her family's barn. He asked her to come with him, not as a visitor, but as his partner. The thought terrified her. New York was another planet, a universe of steel and glass and rules she didn't know. She would be the farm girl, an oddity, a project. But then she looked into his eyes, the same sad eyes she'd seen that first day, and she saw a desperate plea. He needed her, not her land or her simple life, but her quiet strength, her unwavering realness. She said yes. For the first 6 months, he kept his promise to shield her. They lived in his private penthouse, a sanctuary high above the relentless churn of the city. It was their bubble. He showed her his New York, not the one of glittering galas and backstabbing society events, but the one of hidden jazz clubs in the village, of late-night walks through a deserted Central Park, of tiny, family-owned restaurants where no one cared about his last name. She taught him how to cook a proper meal, how to find constellations in a light-polluted sky, how to breathe. In their bubble, they were not a Vanderbilt heir and a farm girl. They were just Leo and Ilara. The night before he was to finally introduce her to his mother, he saw the fear creeping back into her eyes. He took her hands, his grip firm and reassuring. "My world," he had said, his voice low and serious. "It can be cruel. They judge people by their name, by the age of their money. They won't understand you, Ilara, because you are real and they are not." He pulled her closer, his gaze intense. "But none of that matters. You and me. That's all that matters. I will be your shield. No one will ever hurt you. I promise." The memory dissolved, the warmth retreating, leaving behind the biting cold of the present. The beep of the heart monitor seemed to mock her, each pulse a reminder of that broken promise, a vow that had shattered and left her utterly defenseless in the very world he had sworn to protect her from. The promise shattered the very next day. The gates to the Vanderbilt estate on Long Island were not merely gates, they were a declaration. Wrought iron, gilded with gold, twisted into a severe, ostentatious family crest. They were designed to keep the world out, and Ilara felt instantly that they were also designed to keep people in. The mansion itself was not a home. It was a museum of wealth, a cold, marble heart sitting on acres of unnaturally perfect lawn. Inside, the silence was an active presence, broken only by the distant, spectral chime of a grandfather clock. Portraits of stern-faced Vanderbilts from generations past stared down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge her simple dress, her plain leather shoes, her very existence within their sacred halls. Leo, sensing her unease, squeezed her hand, a gesture that felt more nervous than reassuring. Then, Beatrice Vanderbilt descended the grand, sweeping staircase. She did not walk. She glided, a galleon in full sail, draped in a silk dress the color of a winter sky. Her silver hair was flawlessly sculpted, her jewelry understated but astronomically expensive. She was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a frozen lake, vast and treacherous. She did not smile. She offered a cheek for Leo to kiss. Then her eyes, a pale and piercing blue, settled on Ilara. It was not a greeting. It was an appraisal, a swift, merciless inventory that took in every detail and found it all lacking. "So," Beatrice began, her voice as crisp and cold as the air around her, "this is the girl." She didn't use Alara's name. It was the first of 1,000 cuts. The afternoon that followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Beatrice led them to a drawing room that felt more like a stateroom, where tea was served in cups so delicate Alara was afraid to hold one. The questions began, each one a polished dart dipped in poison. "Alara, such a rustic name. Tell me about your family." When Alara spoke of her parents, of their farm, of their quiet, hard-working life, Beatrice would nod slowly, a thin, unsmiling line on her lips. "How fascinating. So you understand. Agriculture. I imagine that's very grounding." The word hung in the air, grounding, as in dirt, as in the soil she was meant to stay rooted in, far from their elevated world. She asked about Alara's education at a state university, her voice laced with a faint, feigned pity. "Of course, a practical choice for a practical background." Leo sat beside Alara, a silent, tense statue. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, but said nothing. He was a lion in the boardroom. But in his mother's presence, he was a child again, stripped of his power. The shield he had promised her was nowhere to be seen. The killing blow came when a servant offered a tray of intricate pastries. Alara politely declined. Beatrice seized the moment. "Oh, you must forgive our elaborate tastes," she said, her eyes twinkling with malice as she addressed Leo, though her words were meant for Alara. "Do be a dear, Leo, and have cook make your farm girl something simpler. I'm sure she's not accustomed to French patisserie." There it was, farm girl, said so casually, so dismissively, as if it were a simple statement of fact. It branded her, defined her, and in that moment, Alara knew it would be her name in this house forever. She looked at Leo, her eyes pleading with him to say something, to defend her, to uphold the promise he had made just last night. He opened his mouth, a flicker of defiance in his eyes, but it died as soon as it met his mother's icy stare. He looked away. "Mother, please," was all he managed, a weak, pathetic whisper that conceded defeat. In that instant, Alara's heart didn't just break, it hardened. She had not married a man, she realized. She had been acquired by a dynasty, and her husband was not her partner, but merely the prince regent to a formidable queen. Their wedding was Beatrice's production, a grand affair where Alara felt like a prop. And after, life in the mansion became her prison. Beatrice's rules were absolute, her tyranny subtle but suffocating. Alara's clothes were wrong, always deemed too plain or unsophisticated. Beatrice would hire stylists who would dress her up like a doll in clothes that felt like costumes. Her opinions on art, on literature, on politics were met with condescending smiles, as if a child had offered a particularly naive thought. She was paraded at charity galas and dinner parties, where Beatrice would delight in telling charming anecdotes about Alara's rural upbringing, stories curated to make her seem hopelessly out of her depth. The guests would chuckle politely, their eyes filled with the same pitying contempt as Beatrice's. She was a court jester, and she didn't even know the jokes. She tried to fight back in her own quiet way. She tried to befriend the staff, but they were loyal to Beatrice, their professionalism, a cold wall she could not penetrate. She tried to take charge of running the household, her one domain as the wife of the heir, but Beatrice would sweep in behind her, changing menus, canceling flower orders, and countermanding her instructions, reminding everyone, especially Alara, who was truly in charge. The worst part was Leo's retreat. When she would confront him in the privacy of their bedroom, her voice choked with tears of frustration and loneliness, he would wither. "That's just how she is, Alara," he'd say, running a hand through his hair. "She means well, she just has a certain way. Or worse, can't you just try to ignore it? For me? Please don't make me choose." He didn't understand that he had already chosen. With every evasion, with every excuse, he chose his mother. He started working longer hours, taking unnecessary business trips, creating a buffer of miles and meetings to protect himself from the war in his own home. He would return and kiss her, his apologies for his absence whispered into her hair, But he never apologized for leaving her undefended on the battlefield. She was alone, surrounded by enemies who smiled at her, in a house that suffocated her with its beauty. The reflection in the gilded mirrors was of a stranger, a woman with haunted eyes and a posture of perpetual defense. The vibrant, confident woman from the farm was gone, replaced by a ghost. And this, she knew, was a hell far worse than one of fire and brimstone. It was a hell of perfect manners and quiet, unrelenting cruelty. A marriage cannot survive in a vacuum, and the one between Leo and Alara had become a vast, cold emptiness, meticulously engineered by Beatrice Vanderbilt. It was into this void that she introduced the weapon that would, she believed, deliver the final, killing blow. Her name was Isabella Thorne. She did not enter their lives quietly. She arrived like a perfectly timed theatrical entrance at the annual Vanderbilt Foundation Gala, an event Alara had been dreading for months. Isabella was a vision in emerald silk, a stark contrast to Alara's simple, navy gown. Her dark hair was styled in a way that looked both effortless and impossibly chic, and she moved through the crowd of New York's elite with the predatory grace of a panther. She was everything Alara was not, polished, sharp, and utterly at home in this glittering shark tank. The first thing she did was embrace Beatrice, a familiar, air-kissing ritual that bespoke years of alliance. Then she turned to Leo, her smile wide and dazzling. "Leo, darling," she purred, her voice a low, smoky melody. "It's been far too long." The hug she gave him lingered just a moment too long, her hand resting on his chest with an easy intimacy that sent a spike of pure ice through Alara's veins. And then, finally, those sharp, intelligent eyes landed on Alara. Isabella's smile didn't falter, but it changed, a subtle shift that turned it from a greeting into an assessment. "And you must be Alara. Leo has told me so much about you." The lie was flawless. Leo barely spoke of her to his mother, let alone to a childhood friend he hadn't seen in years. The entire evening was a carefully orchestrated campaign to render Alara invisible. At their table, the conversation became a fortress of shared history, with Beatrice as the architect and Isabella as the lead enforcer. They spoke of people Alara had never met, of summers in the Hamptons and skiing trips in Gaystad, of inside jokes from their boarding school days. They were a trio, speaking a coded language of privilege, and Alara was the foreigner with no translator. She sat beside her husband, a smile frozen on her face, nodding along to stories she couldn't comprehend, feeling more alone than if she had been in an empty room. Beatrice watched the performance with the quiet satisfaction of a chess master, occasionally steering the conversation with a prompt. "Isabella, do tell Leo about your acquisition in Paris. He'd be so fascinated." Or, "Leo, do you remember that dreadful little boat we had in Monaco, the one Isabella nearly sank?" With every shared memory, they rebuilt a world that had no place for Alara. They were gently, expertly, and ruthlessly erasing her from her own husband's life, right in front of her. The conspiracy was not just in Alara's mind. Later in the evening, as Leo was pulled away by a business associate, she saw Beatrice and Isabella standing near the French doors, their heads close together. The din of the party masked their words, but their expressions were clear. Beatrice had a look of triumphant approval. Isabella's smile was gone, replaced by a look of cool, clinical confidence. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a soldier acknowledging her orders. The campaign escalated in the weeks that followed. Isabella was suddenly everywhere. Beatrice had appointed her to the board of Leo's favorite philanthropic foundation, forcing them into meetings together. Isabella would call Leo at all hours, seeking his invaluable advice on a business deal, her questions always laced with flirtatious compliments about his legendary acumen. She positioned herself as his peer, his equal, the one person who truly understood the pressures of his world. She was the sympathetic ear Alara could no longer be, because Alara was the source of his domestic conflict. "It must be so difficult," she would say to him, over a business lunch, her knee lightly brushing his under the table, "to be with someone who doesn't understand our world, someone so simple." She used Beatrice's favorite insult, but she softened it, turned it from a slur into a statement of feigned sympathy, which was far more insidious. For Leo, Isabella was a siren's song. He was weary of the constant, silent war at home. He was drowning in guilt over his failure to protect Ilara, and that guilt had curdled into resentment. Ilara's sad, reproachful eyes were a constant reminder of his own cowardice. But Isabella didn't reproach him. She celebrated him. She laughed at his jokes, admired his ambition, and made him feel like the powerful, decisive man he was in the boardroom, not the spineless son he was in his mother's house. She was an escape, a balm, an intoxicating drug that numbed the pain of his own weakness. Ilara felt the shift in the tectonic plates of her marriage. Leo became more distant, more secretive. His phone, which had once been left carelessly on the nightstand, was now always screened down or in his pocket. He came home later and later, smelling of wine she hadn't served, and a faint, floral perfume that was not hers. It was La Pearl, Isabella's signature scent. The first time she smelled it on the lapel of his suit jacket, she felt the floor drop out from beneath her. She told herself she was imagining it. She had to. Because Beatrice and Leo had already planted the seed that she was paranoid, that her insecurity was the problem. She clung to the hope that she was wrong, because the alternative was a betrayal so profound it would obliterate what was left of her heart. The end of their fidelity happened on a rainy Thursday night. Ilara and Leo had a bitter, whispered argument over the phone. It was the same argument they always had: his mother, his broken promises, his absence. He hung up, the silence of his hotel suite in Chicago pressing in on him. He went down to the bar, ordering a whiskey, feeling the familiar, toxic cocktail of self-loathing and exhaustion. And then, a voice purred beside him. "Rough day?" It was Isabella. She claimed to be in town for a meeting, a coincidence that was anything but. She listened as he vaguely complained about work, about pressure. She didn't pry. She just listened, her eyes full of understanding. She placed her hand on his. "You deserve to be happy, Leo," she whispered. He looked at her perfect, beautiful face, a face that promised no conflict, no demands, no sad eyes. She was the path of least resistance. She was the easy answer. In that moment, he was too weak to care that she was also the wrong one. He leaned in, and with a kiss that tasted of whiskey and surrender, the betrayal was complete. Hope is a stubborn thing, but even the most resilient hope can be starved to death. Ilara's was dying a slow, painful death in the gilded cage of the Vanderbilt mansion. The faint scent of another woman's perfume and the growing distance in her husband's eyes were no longer just suspicions. They were ghosts that haunted her every waking moment. The truth, she knew, was waiting for her, a monster lurking in the shadows of the life they had built. She found it on a Tuesday, while Leo was away on yet another last-minute business trip to Boston. She was searching for a property deed in his home office, a room that was more of a shrine to his own success than a workspace. In a locked drawer, he had carelessly left open, tucked beneath a stack of old stock reports, was a slim, navy blue credit card statement. The name on it was Leo's, but it was for an account she'd never seen, linked to a post office box in the city. Her heart began to beat a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. With trembling hands, she scanned the list of charges. The St. Regis Hotel, the Four Seasons. A dinner for two at a restaurant so exclusive, she had only read about it. A charge from Cartier for a diamond tennis bracelet she had never received. And there, near the bottom, the final brutal confirmation: La Pearl lingerie. The dates beside each charge corresponded perfectly with Leo's recent business trips. The evidence was not circumstantial, not open to interpretation. It was a cold, clinical ledger of his betrayal, each line item, a nail in the coffin of their marriage. The air left her body in a rush, a silent scream that tore through her but made no sound. She sank into his leather chair, the glossy paper shaking in her hand. Every memory, every promise, every whispered "I love you" was instantly recast in the harsh, unforgiving light of this new reality. The man she loved didn't exist. He was a fiction. She had fallen in love with a ghost, while the real man was buying jewels and lingerie for another woman. She didn't cry. The pain was too deep, too structural for tears. It was a shattering of her very foundation. She sat there for an hour, the room growing dark around her, and a strange, cold calm settled over her. She made a copy of the statement. This was not a ghost she could be talked out of seeing. This was real. She confronted him the moment he walked through the door that evening, radiating a false, cheerful energy. He was holding a bouquet of roses, a classic offering of a guilty man. He stopped short when he saw her standing in the grand foyer, her face a pale, emotionless mask. On the marble table between them lay this single sheet of paper. His smile faltered. "Welcome home, Leo," she said, her voice unnervingly flat. He glanced from her face to the paper, and a flicker of panic crossed his eyes. "What's this?" he asked, his voice a little too loud. "You tell me," she replied. "I believe it's a record of your business expenses. You must have a very demanding client to require such intimate gifts." He picked up the paper, his hand unsteady. He tried to bluff, the denial coming easily, practiced. "Elara, this is a misunderstanding. These are legitimate expenses. You can't just jump to conclusions." "A diamond bracelet is a legitimate expense? Lingerie, Leo?" He faltered, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. He found one, not in a lie, but in an attack. "Have you been going through my desk? My private papers? What gives you the right? What gives me the right?" Her voice finally cracked, the raw pain breaking through the calm. "I am your wife. Or have you forgotten that?" Their raised voices were an invitation. Beatrice appeared at the top of the stairs, a silk robe wrapped around her, her expression one of annoyed authority. "What is the meaning of this commotion?" she demanded, descending the stairs with a heavy, deliberate pace. She didn't wait for an answer. She saw the paper in Leo's hand, the look on Elara's face, and understood immediately. She took the statement from her son's hand, her eyes scanning it with disdain. She let out a short, dismissive laugh. This is what has you acting like a madwoman?" She turned her cold gaze on Elara. "My dear girl, a man of Leo's stature has a complex life. He has expenses and obligations you couldn't possibly comprehend. And for you to go sneaking through his private things like a common thief, it's utterly pathetic." "He's having an affair, Beatrice," Elara cried, her voice raw. "The proof is right there." "Proof?" Beatrice scoffed, waving the paper as if it were a piece of trash. "This is proof of nothing but your own suffocating insecurity. Did you ever stop to think that your constant moping and suspicion might drive a man to seek a moment of peace elsewhere? This house has been miserable since the day you arrived." Leo, seeing his mother expertly dismantling Elara's reality, found his footing. He stepped forward, placing a hand on his mother's arm, presenting a united front. "She's right, Elara. You're being hysterical. This was a mistake, a moment of weakness. It meant nothing, but you're blowing it into some grand tragedy. You're twisting things because you're unhappy." The coordinated assault was dizzying. They were taking the undeniable truth and painting it as a fiction, a delusion born of her own flawed character. "You see conspiracies everywhere because you feel like you don't belong," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with false pity. "You are so desperate for drama, so starved for attention, that you invent these lurid fantasies. You need to control him because you're terrified he'll realize he made a mistake marrying so far beneath him." Elara looked from Beatrice's smug, cruel face to her husband's, who now wore a mask of weary disappointment, as if she were the one who had let him down. He wouldn't meet her eyes. In that moment, she was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of lies. The truth she was holding, the truth that had ripped her soul apart, was being rendered meaningless by the two people who were supposed to be her family. They weren't just denying the affair, they were denying her sanity. She stumbled back, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a chilling, terrifying confusion. They spoke with such conviction. Could they be right? Was she the crazy one? She turned and fled up the stairs, the sound of Beatrice's calm, victorious voice following her. "Let her go, Leo. She needs to calm down and reflect on her destructive behavior." The gaslighting was complete. She was the problem. Her pain was her fault. Her truth was a lie. The aftermath of the confrontation was not a storm, but a chilling, unnatural calm. Alara and Leo existed as ghosts in the cavernous halls of the mansion, communicating only through the stiff, formal intermediaries of their household staff. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the stench of a truth that had been acknowledged and then brutally denied. Alara felt herself receding, becoming smaller, quieter, a spectator to her own life. The love was gone, the trust was a ruin, and all that remained was the hollow architecture of a marriage. It was during this Cold War, at a dinner table laden with food no one wanted to eat, that reality finally tore through the veil of their polite fiction. Beatrice was presiding over the silent meal, her presence as oppressive as always. Alara was listlessly pushing a piece of asparagus around her plate. Leo, who had looked pale and strained for weeks, suddenly put down his fork with a clatter that echoed in the cavernous dining room. He opened his mouth to speak, his eyes finding Alara's across the vast expanse of polished mahogany. For a fleeting second, she saw a glimmer of the man he used to be, a flicker of regret, of a desire to say something, but no words came out. Instead, a look of profound confusion clouded his features. He raised a hand to his temple, his fingers trembling. "Alara?" he whispered, his voice a choked, unfamiliar sound. And then he slumped sideways in his chair, a marionette with its strings abruptly cut, crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs and fine linen. The silence shattered. For a moment, Beatrice was frozen, her regal composure fractured by pure shock. But it was Alara who moved first. The wife, the caregiver, the part of her that still loved the ghost of the man on the floor, surged past the paralysis. She was at his side in an instant, turning him over, loosening his tie, her mind blessedly, mercifully blank of everything but his shallow breathing. Beatrice recovered quickly, her shock morphing into icy command. She didn't rush to her son. She rushed to the telephone, her voice sharp and authoritative as she summoned her personal physician, barking orders at the terrified staff. The hours that followed were a blur of ambulance sirens, the sterile white of a hospital, and the agonizing eternity of a waiting room. The diagnosis, when it came, was a sentence delivered by a grim-faced oncologist in a private, soundproofed room. Glioblastoma, an aggressive, inoperable tumor, coiled like a serpent in the core of his brain. The doctor spoke of treatments that might delay but not prevent the inevitable. He spoke in months, not years. 6, perhaps, if they were lucky. The news landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Alara felt a strange, bifurcated grief. She mourned the vibrant man she had fallen in love with under a Midwestern sky, and in the same breath, she mourned the broken man who had betrayed her. All the anger, all the bitterness of his infidelity, suddenly seemed so small, so petty, in the face of this absolute, final tragedy. All she felt now was a profound, aching pity for this man who was about to lose everything. Beatrice's reaction was different. After the initial, genuine tremor of a mother's pain, a different instinct took over, the instinct for control. This tragedy was not just a personal loss, it was a threat to the Vanderbilt legacy, a complex situation that needed to be managed. Her mind was already working, calculating, planning. And in her cold, strategic grief, Alara was not an ally, she was a liability. The family did not unite in its sorrow. Instead, the battle lines were redrawn, more cruelly than ever before. Leo was moved back to the mansion, which was transformed into a private hospice. A team of nurses, hired and paid by Beatrice, monitored him around the clock. He was her son, her patient, her asset. Beatrice, with Isabella now permanently installed by her side, began to spin a new narrative, a masterpiece of public manipulation. The affair was no longer a dirty secret to be denied. It was reframed as a great, tragic love story. Isabella was no longer the mistress. She was the devoted soulmate, the woman Leo had always truly loved, the one he wanted by his side at the end. They told this story to their friends, to their social circle, to anyone who would listen. They spoke of Leo's final wish for peace and happiness, a wish they claimed Alara, in her bitterness and jealousy, was denying him. It was a breathtakingly cynical move, using a dying man's tragedy as the final act in their campaign to destroy his wife. Alara was systematically pushed to the margins of her own home. She was a stranger, a ghost haunting the edges of the tragedy. When she tried to see Leo, a nurse would politely but firmly block her way. "He's resting," they would say. The doctor said he shouldn't be agitated. Isabella, however, was given free rein. She would sit by his bedside for hours, holding his hand, reading to him, her face a perfect mask of loving sorrow, especially when they had visitors. She took over the running of the household completely, consulting with doctors, managing Leo's medication schedule, and accepting condolences on behalf of the family. She was playing the part of the grieving wife, and she was playing it brilliantly. Alara was treated as less than a servant. She was a legal problem, an inconvenient footnote. In the eyes of the Vanderbilt world, her husband was already gone, and his true love, the rightful heir to his affection, was Isabella. One afternoon, Alara managed to slip past the nurse's watch. She found Leo alone, drifting in the twilight of heavy medication. The room was filled with flowers from people she didn't know, their cards addressed to Leo and Isabella. She sat beside him, taking his hand. It felt frail in hers. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, the fog seemed to clear. He focused on her face, and a flicker of recognition of the old Leo sparked in their depths. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice a dry rasp. "I'm sorry." It was just 2 words, a whisper lost in a storm of sedatives and sickness. But it was enough. It was the truth, a truth she knew Beatrice and Isabella would never allow to be heard. As she sat there, holding her dying, traitorous husband's hand, the last of her grief burned away, leaving behind something hard and cold and clear. This was no longer about a broken heart or a shattered marriage. This was a war over the truth, a fight for the soul of the man she had once loved and for her own survival. They had mistaken her silence for weakness, her grief for defeat. They had no idea they were not crushing a victim. They were forging a warrior. In the wake of Leo's diagnosis, the Vanderbilt mansion became a fortress, and Alara, its sole prisoner. Beatrice now wielded her son's illness with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, cutting Alara out of every aspect of their life. The nurses were Beatrice's sentinels, the household staff her spies. If Alara asked a maid for a fresh towel, the woman would murmur an apology and say she had to check with Mrs. Vanderbilt Sr. first. When she tried to access their joint bank accounts to pay a bill, she found her access had been revoked. The family accountant informed her via a cold, impersonal email that Beatrice was now managing all financials, a measure taken to alleviate any unnecessary stress on Alara during this difficult time. Every move was framed as an act of consideration, but the intent was clear. She was being systematically stripped of her power, her agency, and her role as a wife. She was no longer the lady of the house. She was an inmate, fed and sheltered, but without rights or freedom. Her existence was reduced to a series of closed doors. The door to Leo's room was the most painful of all. She was permitted to see him only in brief, highly supervised intervals. Isabella was always there, playing the role of the devoted consort, fluffing his pillows, speaking to him in low, soothing tones, and shooting Ilara triumphant, pitying glances over his bed. They were a happy family unit performing for a dying man, and she was the unwelcome ghost at the feast. She learned to move through the house like a shadow, her ears attuned to the whispers that stopped the moment she entered a room. It was this newfound stealth, born of desperation and isolation, that led her to the most horrifying discovery of all. One evening, she was walking softly down the upstairs corridor, hoping to find a moment when the nurse was on a break to slip into Leo's room. As she neared the grand library, she heard voices from within. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. One voice was Beatrice's, sharp and impatient. The other was a man's, smooth and clinical. She recognized it as the voice of Mr. Sterling, the Vanderbilt family's lead attorney. Curiosity turned to cold dread. She flattened herself against the wall, hiding in the deep shadows of an alcove, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The timeline is the primary concern," Sterling was saying, his tone dispassionate. "Given the prognosis, we need to act decisively." "I want her cut out, Sterling." Beatrice's voice was a low, venomous hiss. "Completely. I will not have that conniving farm girl laying her filthy hands on a single penny of my son's legacy. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad on marital assets, the lawyer cautioned, but the inheritance clauses are generous. Contesting it after his death would be messy and public. Then we prevent it from ever getting that far, Beatrice snapped. What are our options? There are two primary avenues, Sterling said, his voice dropping further, becoming more conspiratorial. The first is to challenge her competency. We can build a case that she is emotionally unstable, unfit to manage an estate of this magnitude. We can get affidavits from the staff detailing her erratic behavior since the diagnosis. We bring in a psychiatrist, a friendly one, of course, to provide an expert opinion. We file for a conservatorship over Leo's affairs, naming you as the conservator. It positions us perfectly to control the final disposition of the estate. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. Emotionally unstable, erratic behavior. They were taking the grief and pain they had inflicted on her and were planning to use it as a weapon. It was the gaslighting campaign, now being codified into a legal strategy. And the second option? Beatrice pressed. More direct, Sterling replied. We have Leo sign a new will, one that supersedes all previous versions. It would establish a trust, managed by you, with Isabella as the primary beneficiary. Alara would be left a token amount, something so small she couldn't afford to challenge it in court. But he's barely lucid half the time, Beatrice argued. How can he sign a legal document? We only need a brief window of lucidity, the lawyer said calmly. We can adjust his medication to provide that window. We have a doctor on our payroll who will be present to witness the signature and attest, under oath, that Leo was of sound mind and body. In the eyes of the law, it will be perfectly legitimate. A cold, profound silence followed. Alara could almost hear the gears turning in Beatrice's mind as she processed the sheer, elegant depravity of the plan. They were going to drug her son, her own flesh and blood, to make him sign away his wife's future. Prepare the documents for both options, Beatrice said finally. Her voice filled with a chilling finality. We'll proceed on both fronts. We will corner her, Sterling. She will have nothing. She will leave this family with the same dirt on her shoes she arrived with. Alara didn't wait to hear more. She backed away from the door, her movements silent, her body numb with a horror so profound it felt like ice in her veins. She retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. For a moment, she thought she might be sick. The cruelty of it, the cold, calculated evil, was beyond anything she could have imagined. They weren't just trying to steal money. They were trying to erase her, to invalidate her marriage, to declare her insane, and to manipulate a dying man's final act on earth into a weapon of their own greed. But the wave of nausea passed, and what replaced it was not fear or despair, but a fury so pure and so cold it burned. The naive farm girl was gone. The heartbroken wife was gone. The victim was gone. All that was left was a woman with nothing to lose. They had made a fatal error. They thought she was a mouse cowering in the walls. They had no idea they had just shown her the entire layout of their trap, and in doing so, had given her the one thing she needed to fight back, a map. She walked over to her closet, reached into the back of a forgotten shoebox, and pulled out a cheap, prepaid burner phone she had bought months ago, just in case. She turned it on, the small screen glowing in the dark. The time for enduring was over. The time for gathering evidence had begun. The woman who emerged from that locked room was not the same one who had fled there. The haunted, broken Alara was gone, burned away in the crucible of pure rage. In her place was a creature of unnerving calm, her eyes holding a stillness that was far more menacing than any outburst. This new Alara did not argue, did not cry, did not plead. She became a model of quiet compliance. When Beatrice informed her that her presence was too stressful for Leo and restricted her visits to 15 minutes a day, Alara simply nodded. When Isabella, in a brazen display of power, asked her to fetch the mail, Alara did so without a word of protest. She ate her meals in silence, endured their thinly veiled insults with a placid expression, and moved through the mansion like a wraith. Beatrice and Isabella saw this transformation and were delighted. They mistook her silence for surrender, her compliance for defeat. They believed they had finally, utterly broken the farm girl. Their arrogance made them careless, and their carelessness was the weapon Ilara now wielded against them. Her nights became a secret second life. Using the burner phone and a library computer, she meticulously researched and ordered the tools of her quiet rebellion. Tiny, voice-activated audio recorders disguised as USB chargers, pens, and even a small digital clock. They were delivered to a private mail locker in the city, which she visited on the one afternoon a week she was permitted to leave the house, under the guise of a walk for fresh air. She became a student of the house's rhythms, of the staff's schedules, of the blind spots in the security cameras. Late at night, when the great house was finally still, she would slip from her room. She placed a recorder disguised as a power adapter in the library, another in Beatrice's private sitting room, where she took her calls. The most dangerous placement was in Leo's room. One night, while the nurse was on her dinner break, she entered the room where her husband lay sleeping. Her heart pounded as she replaced the digital clock on his bedside table with her own identical, recording-enabled version. It faced the two chairs where Beatrice and Isabella spent their time, a silent, digital witness to their bedside vigil. Her nocturnal missions also took her to Leo's office. Using a key she had duplicated months ago, she would let herself in and, with the light of her phone, photograph reams of documents, financial statements, insurance policies, partnership agreements, and the crown jewel, a draft of the new will Mr. Sterling had sent over, which she found in Beatrice's unlocked desk drawer. Each photo was immediately uploaded to an encrypted cloud server, a digital fortress of truth. She kept a meticulous log on a secure notes app, documenting every instance of neglect. The 5th of October, 10:15 p.m., she wrote. B and I entered Leo's room, discussed auctioning his watch collection for 25 minutes, did not speak to him or check his comfort, laughed about a memory of him falling off a horse as a child. The 7th of October, 3 p.m., Leo was agitated, trying to speak. Isabella told him to hush now and turned up the volume on the television. She then spent the next hour on the phone with a friend, planning a ski trip to Aspen. The first piece of audio she retrieved was a revelation. She sat in her locked bathroom, a pair of headphones plugged into her laptop, and listened. It was Beatrice and Isabella, speaking in Leo's room, believing him to be unconscious. Is he ever going to just let go? Isabella's voice was laced with an ugly impatience. This is all taking so much longer than the doctors said. Patience, my dear, Beatrice's voice replied, cool and reptilian. The legal groundwork is being laid. Sterling assures me that by the time he passes, the farm girl will be lucky to get his old college textbooks. Just keep playing your part. The grieving lover is a very sympathetic role. I'm just tired of pretending to be sad, Isabella complained. And his breathing is so loud. It's hard to concentrate on my portfolio reports. Ilara listened, her blood turning to ice. They were sitting beside her dying husband, complaining that his death was an inconvenience. She saved the file, labeling it simply Exhibit A. She knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed a guide, a strategist. Her mind went back to a boy from a neighboring farm, a boy who had been her friend long before the name Vanderbilt had ever entered her life, Ben Carter. He had been smart and scrappy, escaping their rural world on a scholarship and becoming a litigator in the city. He wasn't a slick corporate lawyer like Sterling, he was a fighter. She met him at a noisy, anonymous coffee shop in Queens, a world away from the Vanderbilt's manicured universe. She looked pale and thin, but Ben saw a hardness in her eyes he'd never seen before. She laid out the story, her voice low and steady, her narrative punctuated by the cold facts she had gathered. She played him a short, damning clip from the audio file. Ben listened, his expression shifting from concerned friend to shocked, then furious attorney. He was silent for a long time after she finished. My God, Ilara, he finally said, shaking his head. This is monstrous. Can they do it, Ben? She asked. Can they have me declared incompetent? Can they get away with that will? They can certainly try, he said, his eyes hardening with professional resolve. People with that kind of money can bend the law in horrifying ways. But they are arrogant and they are sloppy. They have no idea who they're dealing with. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You've done incredible work. You've been methodical. Now, we use it. Don't stop. Let them think you're broken. Let them get comfortable. They are building their own gallows, Elara. Every word they speak into your recorders, every document you photograph, we're just giving them the rope to finish the job. For the first time in months, Elara felt a flicker of something that wasn't rage or despair. It was power. The weeks that followed bled into a bleak, gray autumn. Leo's condition deteriorated with a cruel, unhurried pace. The glimmers of lucidity became rarer. The periods of silent, medicated sleep grew longer. As his life waned, the energy in the Vanderbilt mansion grew more frantic, more predatory. The vultures began to gather. They came in expensive European cars, dressed in somber designer colors that looked more like costumes for a play than expressions of grief. There was Leo's uncle, Marcus, a man whose only profession was being a Vanderbilt, his face a mask of sorrow that couldn't quite hide the anxious calculations in his eyes. There were cousins and second cousins, people Elara had barely met, who now milled about the mansion's lower floors, drinking Beatrice's finest scotch and speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the impending tragedy, their conversations inevitably drifting to the disposition of the Vale ski house or the future of the company's stock. They were not here to mourn a man. They were here to witness the transfer of an empire, to ensure their place in the line of succession. Beatrice and Isabella presided over this morbid theater, the twin queens of a dying king's court. They were masters of performative grief. For the visitors, Isabella was a tragic angel, her eyes always seemingly on the verge of tears, her hand constantly clutching a silk handkerchief. Beatrice was the stoic matriarch, enduring the unthinkable with a regal strength that her peers found deeply admirable. But Elara's hidden microphones told a different story. They captured the whispers in the hallways, the impatience, the greed. He's holding on for too long, Marcus complained to Beatrice one evening. The market is volatile. The board needs to know who will be in control. Everything is being handled, Beatrice assured him, her voice like steel. The transition will be seamless. Amidst this pageant of avarice, Elara moved with a singular, quiet purpose. While the relatives debated the fate of his fortune downstairs, she was the one who tended to the failing man upstairs. The contrast was stark, a silent testament to the lie at the heart of the Vanderbilt family. They saw a body, a vessel of wealth that was slowly emptying. She saw a human being in his final, terrifying moments. While Isabella would read the fashion pages of Vogue aloud beside his bed, her voice a monotonous drone, Elara would read him the poetry of Walt Whitman, the same verses they had once read to each other in Central Park. While Beatrice discussed funeral arrangements with her assistant in the doorway, Elara would gently massage Leo's frail hands. Her touch meant not just for comfort, but as a simple, human connection, a reminder that he was not alone. She was the one who moistened his cracked lips with a cool sponge, who adjusted his pillows to ease his labored breathing, who spoke to him not about what he was leaving behind, but of the simple things he had once loved. She told him stories of the farm, of a new foal that had been born, of the way the frost looked on the fields in the early morning light. She was giving him back the world he had sought when he first met her, a world of peace and authenticity. She did it not for an audience, not for any hope of reconciliation, but for the man he had once been, and for herself. It was her private, dignified farewell, an act of grace in a house devoid of it. The narrative had now come full circle, spiraling back to that cold, tense moment that had opened her story. The hospital room had been recreated in his bedroom, with its antiseptic smells mingling with the cloying scent of Isabella's perfume. The relatives had gone for the evening, leaving only the core players. Beatrice and Isabella sat in their usual chairs, their patience wearing thin. Elara was by his side, wiping his brow. And then came the words, Beatrice's venomous whisper to Isabella, sharp and clear in the quiet room. Look at her, still playing the dutiful wife. The farm girl probably thinks she'll get a bigger piece of the pie this way. The words struck Elara, just as they had before. She felt the familiar, reflexive tightening in her gut, the urge to scream, to fight, to defend herself. Her hand, hidden by the blankets, clenched into a fist. But this time, something was different. Beneath the pain was a layer of ice. She knew, with absolute certainty, that the tiny digital clock on the bedside table, its red numbers glowing impassively, had captured every syllable. The insult was no longer just a wound. It was Exhibit B. It was ammunition. She simply breathed through the pain and continued to gently stroke Leo's hand, her composure unshakable. Her silence infuriated Beatrice more than any argument could have. The end came 2 nights later, just after 3 in the morning. The house was finally quiet. The nurse was on her break. Beatrice and Isabella, exhausted by their performance, had retired to their rooms. It was just Ilara. She had been dozing in the armchair when a change in his breathing woke her. It was a shallow, hitching sound, the sound of a final, desperate struggle. She was by his side in an instant, her hand enclosing his. His eyes, which had been closed for days, fluttered open one last time. They were unfocused, staring at some point beyond her, beyond the room. She leaned in close, her voice a soft whisper. "It's okay, Leo. You can rest now. It's okay." Whether he heard her or not, she would never know. But his body seemed to relax, the frantic struggle ceasing. He took one long, shuddering breath, and then there was nothing. A profound, absolute stillness descended. The only sound was the steady, damning, unbroken tone from the heart monitor. It was over. She stood there for a long moment, the silence of the room pressing in on her. With a hand that did not tremble, she reached out and gently closed his eyes. Then she turned and walked to the door. The alarm from the monitor began to shriek through the house, a shrill announcement of victory for some, of tragedy for others. She could hear the frantic footsteps, the opening of doors, the raised voices. The vultures were coming. But Ilara did not wait for them. Her vigil was over. The fight was about to begin. The funeral was a masterwork of hypocrisy. St. Patrick's Cathedral was filled to overflowing with the titans of New York finance, politics, and society, all gathered to pay their respects to the fallen Vanderbilt heir. Beatrice, veiled in black Dior, was the very picture of maternal grief, leaning heavily on the arm of a somber, beautiful Isabella. They wept gracefully, their tears as carefully managed as the seating chart. Ilara sat in the front pew, as was her right, but she sat apart, a small, solitary island of genuine sorrow in an ocean of performance. She wore a simple black dress, no veil, no theatrics. She did not weep. Her grief was a private, silent thing, and she would not cheapen it by putting it on display for this audience. To the onlookers, she was a cold, strange figure. They whispered about the farm girl's lack of emotion, her odd detachment. They had no idea that her stillness was not an absence of feeling, but the rigid calm of a soldier before a battle. A week later, the final act began. They were gathered in the top-floor conference room of Finch, Sterling, and Thorne, a law firm whose name seemed to mock the very air Ilara breathed. The room was a cathedral of corporate power, paneled in dark mahogany, with a view of Central Park that was worth more than most countries' GDP. The air was thick with the scent of old leather, expensive cologne, and palpable greed. Beatrice, Isabella, Uncle Marcus, and a few other key relatives sat on one side of a massive, polished table. Their somber funeral attire had been replaced with sharp business suits and expensive jewelry. The pretense of grief had been shed. This was a victory lap. They were relaxed, entitled, exchanging small, knowing smiles. They were simply waiting for the official coronation. Ilara sat opposite them, alone. Ben Carter, her lawyer, sat a few seats down. A quiet, observant presence they all dismissed as a procedural formality. Presiding at the head of the table was Mr. Alistair Finch, the senior partner, a man in his late 70s with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of 3 generations of Vanderbilts. He was a relic of an older, more principled era, and his face was an unreadable mask of professional decorum. He adjusted his spectacles, the silence in the room deepening. "We are gathered today," he began, his voice dry as old parchment, "for the reading of the last will and testament of my client, Leo Arthur Vanderbilt. The estate, as you know, is substantial. He paused, letting the weight of that word settle in the room. Beatrice gave a slight, regal nod, as if accepting a compliment. The document I have here, Finch continued, tapping a thick vellum envelope, is the will in question. It was executed on. He paused again, looking down at the document. October the 11th. The date dropped into the room like a stone. A stunned silence followed. Beatrice's smug composure instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp, incredulous glare. "That's impossible," she snapped, her voice losing its polished edge. Leo was barely conscious on that date. His final testament was prepared by Mr. Sterling on September 30th. We have a copy right here. She gestured to her own lawyer, who began to open his briefcase. Mr. Finch held up a hand, a simple gesture that nonetheless commanded absolute authority. "I can assure you, Mrs. Vanderbilt, that this will, executed on October 11th, is perfectly valid. It was signed by your son, in my presence, and in the presence of his attending physician, Dr. Albright, who certified that he was of sound mind and fully aware of his actions. This document legally nullifies any and all previous wills." Beatrice stared at him, her face a mixture of fury and confusion. This was not part of the plan. This was a deviation, an impossibility. The air crackled with tension. Finch, unperturbed, continued. "Before we proceed to the distribution of assets, there is a specific, non-negotiable clause that must be executed first." He cleared his throat and read directly from the will. "It is my final and most urgent directive that, before any further part of this document is read, a private video message, which I have prepared for this specific occasion, be played in its entirety for all present parties." A collective gasp went through the Vanderbilt side of the table. A video? It was unheard of, bizarre, and deeply unsettling. Beatrice looked as if she'd been struck. Finch calmly reached for a remote control. With a soft whir, a large screen descended from a hidden recess in the ceiling. He pressed another button, and the screen flickered to life. And then there was Leo. He was not in his bed. He was sitting in a simple armchair, dressed in a cashmere sweater. He was shockingly thin, his face gaunt, but his eyes, staring directly into the camera, were burning with a fierce, undeniable clarity. The room was so quiet, the sound of breathing seemed to be an intrusion. "If you are watching this," Leo began, his voice weak but steady, "it means I'm gone. And it means my mother's plans have, for once, been thwarted." He paused, and his eyes seemed to find Alara's, even through the screen. His expression softened, the hardness replaced by a profound, heartbreaking regret. "Alara," he said, and her name in his voice was a physical blow. "My wife, the first thing I have to say is that I am sorry. I was a coward. I loved you, and I failed you. I let my fear of my mother, of this family, poison the only pure and good thing in my life. I promised to be your shield, and instead, I let them use me as a weapon against you. There is no excuse for what I did. I only hope that what I do today can serve as the apology I was too weak to give you in person." He took a shaky breath, and when he spoke again, his gaze hardened as he turned to address the others. "Mother," he said, his voice laced with a lifetime of repressed anger, "you taught me the price of everything and the value of nothing. You worship a name, a legacy built on cold stone and colder money. You saw my wife's goodness as a threat to that legacy, and you tried to destroy her for it. You never once cared about my happiness, only my compliance." His eyes shifted slightly, as if looking at Isabella. "And Isabella, you didn't love me. You loved the idea of me, the name, the access. You were a willing pawn in my mother's cruel game. I pity you." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity making everyone in the room flinch. "I know everything," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each word a hammer blow. "I know about the lawyers. I know about the plan to have Alara declared mentally incompetent. I know about the new will you were waiting for me to be drugged enough to sign. I heard you. In my so-called unconscious state, I heard it all. The whispers beside my bed, the impatience for my death, the cold calculations." The color drained from Beatrice's face. Isabella looked physically ill. They were exposed, stripped bare by the ghost on the screen. And so, Leo concluded, a faint, sad smile on his lips, I decided to write one final chapter myself. I have taken steps to ensure that my estate is distributed, not according to your greed, but according to my own sense of justice. Mr. Finch, please proceed. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute, a crushing, suffocating vacuum filled with nothing but the sound of Beatrice's and Isabella's worlds shattering around them. As the screen went black, the silence in the room was a living entity, thick and suffocating. It was the sound of utter devastation. Beatrice Vanderbilt's face was a horrifying canvas of disbelief, fury, and dawning panic. The blood had drained from Isabella's cheeks, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll that had been cracked. They had been exposed, judged, and condemned by the very man they thought they had so cleverly managed. Beatrice was the first to break. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the polished floor. "A forgery!" she shrieked, her voice a ragged, ugly sound that bore no resemblance to her usual measured tones. "This is a farce. That is not my son. He was sick, delirious. This witch," she spat, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. She manipulated him, poisoned his mind against his own family. Alara did not flinch. She simply met her mother-in-law's gaze, her expression one of quiet, sorrowful finality. She felt a single tear trace a path down her cheek, not a tear of sadness, but of release. It was a tear for the man Leo had finally become in his last, brave act. Mr. Finch waited patiently for Beatrice's tirade to run out of steam, his hands steepled before him. When she finally fell back into her chair, breathing heavily, he calmly adjusted his spectacles. "If you are quite finished, Mrs. Vanderbilt," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "I will now proceed with the particulars of the will." He picked up the document, the rustle of the paper sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. "First, to the matter of personal effects," Finch read, his tone dispassionate. "Leo has directed that his art collection, his automobiles, and his renowned collection of Patek Philippe timepieces be sold at public auction. The entire proceeds, estimated to be in excess of $50 million, are to be donated to found a new research wing at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, dedicated to the study of glioblastoma." A collective groan went through the Vanderbilt relatives. Uncle Marcus looked as if he might be sick. Those were assets they had all been mentally dividing amongst themselves. Finch continued, turning a page. "Now, to the disposition of the primary liquid assets, including all stocks, bonds, and cash holdings in domestic and international accounts." He paused, looking directly at Alara. "These are bequeathed, in their entirety, to my beloved wife, Alara Grace Vanderbilt." He then read Leo's words from the will. "I leave her not only my fortune, but also my deepest and most profound apology. It is my hope that this will give her the freedom to build a life of peace and happiness, a life she so richly deserves, far from the corrosive influence of my family's name." Finch looked up from the page. "The total value of the liquid portfolio, as of the market's close yesterday, is estimated at $327 million. The number hung in the air, a weapon of unimaginable power. Beatrice let out a choked, strangled gasp. Isabella stared at Alara with wide, unblinking eyes, a look of pure, venomous hatred twisting her beautiful features. For a fleeting, insane moment, Beatrice's expression shifted to one of cunning. The properties, she was thinking. The real estate was worth even more. She still had the crown jewels of the empire. Finch, as if reading her mind, turned to the next clause. "To my mother, Beatrice Vanderbilt, and to her companion, Isabella Thorne," he read, "I bequeath all real estate holdings currently titled to the Vanderbilt family. This includes the Long Island estate and its grounds, the Manhattan penthouse on Fifth Avenue, and the ski lodge in Vail, Colorado." A flicker of triumphant relief crossed Beatrice's face. She had won. She had kept the land, the legacy, the physical symbols of their power, but Finch was not finished. "This bequest," he continued, his voice steady and relentless, "is made with the non-negotiable condition that the inheritors assume all associated financial encumbrances, liens, and outstanding debts tied to these properties. He picked up a second document, a financial summary. My client took the liberty of having a forensic accounting of these debts prepared. The Long Island estate carries a mortgage of $150 million, which, as you know, Mrs. Vanderbilt, you refinanced 5 years ago to cover my late father's significant losses in the Asian market. The penthouse is leveraged for an additional $80 million. Combined with other liabilities, the total debt attached to these properties is approximately $275 million. He put the paper down. Given the current market, the total estimated value of the real estate is $240 million. The properties carry a net liability of roughly $35 million. The trap had sprung. Leo had not given them an asset. He had given them a financial black hole. He had taken Beatrice's most deeply hidden secret, that the Vanderbilt empire was a house of cards drowning in debt, and exposed it in the most brutal, public way imaginable. She hadn't just lost the money. She had been handed the ruin she had spent years trying to conceal. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. But Leo had one final, elegant checkmate. Finally, Mr. Finch said, reaching into the envelope, "The will directs that this item, a USB flash drive left in my firm's possession, be handed over to the estate's executors. The will describes its contents as audio recordings detailing a conspiracy to commit testamentary fraud and exert undue influence over a terminally ill patient." He held up the small, black drive. The will explicitly states that these recordings are to be used as incontrovertible evidence to defend the legitimacy of this testament against any and all legal challenges brought by Mrs. Beatrice Vanderbilt or Miss Isabella Thorne, and if necessary, to be turned over to the district attorney's office. It was over. They were completely and utterly defeated, legally disarmed, and on the verge of criminal charges if they dared to fight. The dam of Beatrice's composure finally broke. She launched herself forward, a shrill, animalistic scream tearing from her throat, her hands clawing at the table as if she meant to lunge at Finch, at Alara, at the ghost of her own son. Isabella, ever the pragmatist, saw the truth with cold, hard clarity. The game was lost. The money was gone. She looked at the screaming, pathetic woman who had been her ally, and her expression was one of pure disgust. She stood up, straightened her skirt, and without a single word, turned and walked out of the room, abandoning the Vanderbilt dynasty as it sank. Amidst the chaos of Beatrice's breakdown and Uncle Marcus's frantic whispering, Alara rose from her chair. Her face was calm. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a profound weariness and the quiet dignity of a survivor. She gave a small, grateful nod to Mr. Finch, and then to Ben. Her work here was done. She walked toward the door, leaving the wreckage of the Vanderbilt family behind her. As she stepped out into the hallway, the sound of Beatrice's hysterical sobbing was the last echo of a world she was finally, blessedly, free from. Alara did not stay to watch the glorious, screeching implosion of the Vanderbilt dynasty. She had no interest in their ruin. As Beatrice's screams echoed in the mahogany-paneled room, Alara simply turned and walked away. She didn't look back. Ben Carter met her in the hallway, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. He handled the rest, the transfer of funds, the legal barricades, the endless paperwork. Alara's only instruction was to liquidate everything. She wanted no connection to the stocks, the companies, or the blood money that had fueled that toxic empire. She wanted only the clean, anonymous finality of a number in a bank account. She did not take a private jet. She took a yellow taxi to JFK, walked through the terminal with the anonymous crowds, and sat in a coach-class seat on a flight bound for the Midwest. As the plane climbed, she watched the glittering, jagged skyline of New York shrink below her. It looked like a field of broken glass, a beautiful, dangerous thing she was finally escaping. There was no triumph in her heart, no thrill of victory. The rage that had sustained her for months had burned out, leaving behind a vast, quiet emptiness. It was the feeling a soldier must have when the war is finally, truly over. A profound, hollow peace. The farm was waiting for her, unchanged, a sanctuary of rolling green hills and honest, silent trees. The air smelled of rain and soil, a scent that cleansed the last of the city's sterile perfume from her lungs. For the first few days, she did nothing. She walked the fields, her boots sinking into the familiar soft earth. She sat on the porch swing, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, a spectacle more magnificent than any Vanderbilt gala. She was letting the quiet of her old life seep back into her bones, letting it heal the fractures within her. About a week after her return, a small, unassuming cardboard box arrived by courier. It was from Mr. Finch's office. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. It wasn't jewelry or deeds, or any other remnant of her former life. Inside, nestled on a bed of simple cotton, was a single, perfect acorn and a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. It was addressed to her in Leo's familiar, elegant handwriting. With a deep breath, she broke the seal. The letter was dated October 11th, the same day he had signed the will. "My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, then it is finished. And I am so sorry for the hell I must have put you through to get here. There are things you need to know, truths I was too much of a coward to tell you in life. My diagnosis didn't come after our fight. It came months before, long before Isabella re-entered our lives. I knew I was dying, and I fell into a despair so deep I thought it would drown me. My first, selfish instinct was to cling to you, to let you care for me and watch me fade away. But the thought of what that would do to you, of forcing you to endure that slow, ugly process, was a torment worse than the disease itself. I couldn't bear the thought of your bright, beautiful spirit being chained to my sickbed, of your life being consumed by my death. So I made a plan. A foolish, arrogant, and cruel plan. I thought that your hatred would be a cleaner wound than your grief. I believed that if I could make you despise me, you would leave me. You would go back home, heal your anger, and eventually be free to live a full life, unburdened by my memory. I knew my mother would be only too happy to help me push you away, and Isabella was her perfect, willing tool. I orchestrated my own betrayal, Alara. I let it happen. It was the most monstrous act of my life, a misguided, twisted attempt to protect you. But I made one catastrophic miscalculation. I underestimated you. I never imagined you would be strong enough to stay. I never dreamed that you would endure the humiliation, the cruelty, the loneliness, and still find it in you to show me kindness in my final days. Your quiet strength was a miracle that shamed my weakness. When I lay in that bed, drifting in and out, I heard everything, and I realized my plan had not been to save you, but to destroy the best part of myself. That is when I called Mr. Finch. I decided that if my life was a failure, my death would have a purpose. It would be my final act of love. This money is not a prize, my love. It is your freedom. It is the armor I failed to be for you. Use it to build a life of joy and peace. Use it to create a world so beautiful and so safe that no one and nothing can ever hurt you again. I have left you an acorn. It is from the great oak on the west hill of the estate, the one we sat under on our first visit. Please plant it. Let it grow into something strong and deep-rooted, something real. Let it be a testament not to our sad story, but to the love that was true within it, the love that I will carry with me wherever I am going. Forever yours, Leo. The letter fell from her hands. The tears she had refused to shed for months finally came, a silent, cleansing flood. She wasn't weeping for a traitor, but for a tragic, foolish man who had loved her so imperfectly, yet so completely, that he had made himself a villain to try and save her. The anger was gone, washed away by a wave of profound, heartbreaking understanding. The next morning, as the sun rose, Alara took the small, perfect acorn and walked to a quiet spot in her favorite field. She dug her hands into the rich, dark earth and planted the seed. Her life had been torn down to its foundations, but here, in her own soil, she was planting a new beginning. She had lost a husband, but she had found herself. She had survived the vultures, the liars, the thieves, and she had emerged not broken, but forged into something stronger. She was a woman who knew the true value of things, not their price. She was the farm girl, and she was finally home. Never underestimate the quiet dignity of a person who has endured too much. Their silence is not weakness. It is the calm before a storm of justice.